Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to today's program. We are extremely excited to host one of the first debates, I would say, in the masjid over here, Sheikh Mustafa, one of the first debates over here. This debate is sponsored by Why Islam, One Legacy Radio, and the Islamic Society of Corona, Norco. So we want to thank all of our sponsors, and obviously we want to thank our dear attendees for coming out today. We'll jump right into the issue of the debate. The debate is called, Does Allah Exist? We wanted to keep it very specific to Allah versus the term that's commonly used, God. God has many different meanings, has many different terms, can mean something to everyone. So Allah is very specific to what Muslims believe in as the God, the only God worthy of worship. This debate, just like we said, will be on broadcast on onelegacyradio.com, so we encourage you guys to check out the podcast right after the debate. We have two of our esteemed guests. Our first guest is Dan Mages, and our second is obviously Hamsa Tortzis, coming to us from England. And last but not least, the moderator for the session will be our very own Sheikh Mustafa, who will be joining us as a moderator for today. Just really quickly going over the bios of each speaker. Dan Mages is actually graduated as a magna cum laude from Master's College with a BA in Biblical Studies with an emphasis in Bible exposition. Dan is a good friend of mine. He has basically taught just around everywhere. He used to be actually Christian, believe it or not. He's a former Christian, and he currently views himself as and this is what I love about Dan, he's an earthling, a world citizen, a vegan, humanist, utilitarian, determinist, socialist, a member of the Zeitgeist movement, and just like I said, this is Dan for you. He teaches philosophy and religion at a number of universities, both in Southern California and online. Hamsa Tortzis. Hamza Andreas Tortzis is, and yes, it is pronounced Georges. Yes? Yeah, cool. Georges. It's spelled with a TZ, but O-R-T-Z-I-S. Anyways, Hamza Andreas Tortzis is an international public speaker on Islam, a writer, lecturer, and an intellectual activist. Hamza converted to Islam in October of 2002 after a process of philosophical inquiry and intellectual investigation. Currently, he is a senior researcher and lecturer for an organization called IRA, the Islamic Education and Research Academy. We welcome both speakers today, and our moderator, just like I said, is our dear Sheikh Mustafa, who is the Imam and leader of the masjid over here in the Islamic Center, Islamic Society of Corona, Norco. Last but not least, we want to encourage everyone that we do have an Islamic information table right up here. It's what we call our dawah table. If you do have questions about Islam afterwards, we will have volunteers right over here at the table. So right after the session, you're more than welcome to grab any of the pamphlets there and talk to someone a bit more about Islam, or if you have more questions for the speakers. We will be ending promptly at 8 o'clock for the next session that comes right after this session, which is called the Islamization of Weed. It should be an interesting program with our dear Sheikh Yasser Fazaqa. Without further ado, I'll introduce our dear Sheikh Mustafa to introduce the program.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. As you know, at ISCN, we're very prompt. We try to start exactly on the dot. Unfortunately, there was some traffic, so that's unavoidable. So we're going to get right into the program. I'm going to explain to you what the format is going to be. We're going to have a introduction by both speakers. Not really an introduction. The main point of their argument will be 25 minutes each. It will be timed. I'll be giving them 3-minute cards on when they need to stop, and then another 1-minute warning reminder. And then once the 1 minute is over, the 25 minutes are over, I will actually stop them because we need to continue with the sake of time. And then there will be 7-minute rebuttals each. Each one will be given 7 minutes to go and do a rebuttal, and then there will be an open Q&A. Now keep in mind during the Q&A, while you're listening to the lecture, write down any questions you may have because you may forget them. So write them down, and we're only taking questions. We're not taking comments, and we don't need any other lectures after the lectures. So please keep that in mind. It'll be restricted to 30 seconds per question, and we begin. Dan, it's fine, you speak first? Okay, so we begin with Dan will be speaking first. You have a presentation as well? Yeah. Okay, and he has a presentation. The stage is yours. 25 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, and thank you all for coming this evening. I want to thank Amir Murtaban for the invitation and for Mustafa Umar for moderating the debate, and most of all Hamsa Tortzis for engaging with me this evening. Before I begin, I want to make certain things clear. I think very highly of the vast majority of Muslims around the world. I can remember holding hands and locking arms with my friend Farouk in Turkey. I have an amazing story. Well, actually, it's a funny story. We were in Turkey, and my friend Mark we were greeting each other, and as the customary greeting, we kissed on both cheeks. But my friend Mark didn't know which way to go, right or left, when we were saying our goodbyes, and so they both went left, and they locked lips. And they stood back from each other, and Farouk looked at my friend Mark, and he says, "We don't do that here." But the hospitality of Muslims all over the world have been absolutely amazing. I think of the bazaars that I've been to and the gift shops in Jerusalem. The customer service is absolutely unbelievable. I think of Nordstrom's, and I think that the customer service there makes Nordstrom's look like a 99-cent store. I mean, when Nordstrom starts serving hot tea, then we can compare. Moreover, I've had the pleasure and honor of taking the Quran and its interpreters with the esteemed and humble scholar Dr. Hamid Mavani at Claremont School of Theology. I've also had the pleasure of taking Dr. Zain Qassam at Pomona College. Moreover, I live and engage in spirited debate on a daily basis with my roommate Jawad, who's a Sunni Muslim from Afghanistan. It's important to know that I spent many years as a committed theist, as Amir mentioned. I spent the last 12 of the last 15 years of my life as a deeply devout Christian. I spent years evangelizing on the streets, attempting to persuade people to give their life to God. I prayed incessantly for God's guidance, insight, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, peace, and love. I went overseas on multiple occasions, specifically to persuade people to give their life to God and build up religious institutions. I was compelled to study religion academically at the Master's College, at Fuller Theological Seminary, at Claremont School of Theology. You may find it interesting that 11 years ago as a Christian, I rejected the Trinity on the basis that it was not taught in Scripture. I defended the notion in writing and in public debate that Jesus was not God, but the human Messiah in accord with the Quran. In other words, I upheld at least half of the Shahada, that there is only one God, and that God, according to the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran, is one person, not three. Although I am currently a truth-seeking atheist, since atheism doesn't say anything about what I do believe, only what I don't, I rarely refer to myself as such. However, I see myself as a truth-seeking, life-promoting world citizen that desires every human on the planet to have access to healthy, cruelty-free food, clean water, pure air, safe shelter, and access to health care. More than anything else, I long to see love, peace, justice reign throughout the world. However, along with most of the world's population, I still desire to live forever. In fact, if God exists, if God is reasonable and good, if God will make all wrongs right, I hope that I am wrong this evening and would be more than happy to change my views. Nevertheless, there is a difference and a distinction between what I want, what I desire, what I hope for, thus the term wishful thinking, and what is likely, what is probable, what I have evidence for, that is, what I know with relative certainty. I want to fly, I want to breathe underwater, I want to bring back to life the multitude of sentient beings that have perished prematurely, like the estimated 1 million Iraqis within the last decade, a considerable number of them women and children, the vast majority being non-combatants. Reality is that it's highly unlikely that I will be able to achieve any of these particular wishes. In like manner, though I hope a good and reasonable God is governing the world, I am compelled by overwhelming evidence to think otherwise. It is significant to point out that in a certain sense, we're all atheists. Given the definition of atheism as without belief in God or gods, the fact of the matter is the majority of us are already atheists in regards to the thousands, even millions of gods that have been worshipped, honored, prayed to, served, and promoted. There is Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, Ra, the Egyptian sun god, Brahman, the Hindu creator god, Vishnu, the sustainer, Shiva, the destroyer, the god of transformation. How about the goddess Aphrodite? Or Dionysus, the god of wine, Nike, Hermes, Apollo, Thor, Osiris. I have only gone one god further. While I realize that no one can prove or disprove Allah's existence with 100% certainty, I also realize that I can't prove with absolute certainty that goblins, ghosts, gremlins, or leprechauns don't exist. Somewhere, especially if they're invisible beings. Regardless, I don't need 100% certainty in order to have a high degree of assurance that these things, including the magical beings like Santa and the Tooth Fairy or Allah, do not exist. Since a hypothesis that offers the best explanation for the widest range of evidence is more likely true than other competing hypotheses, what I need to do is contrast the two competing hypotheses before us and determine which hypothesis better explains available evidence. Hypothesis number 1, Allah exists, roughly defined as a spiritual being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, who is the personal creator and sustainer of the world. Hypothesis 2, Allah does not exist. You'll notice that my arguments this evening gain strength the more we suppose Allah is actively and continually involved in the world, while they lose strength the more we suppose Allah is unconcerned with the world. The reason for this is simple. A detached, indifferent God would leave little to no empirical evidence of its existence. Because the following arguments are evidentially based, they have little to say about a God that, for example, created the world intentionally to appear as if no God exists, a God that is merely an impersonal first cause, or a whimsical deist God who created the initial state of the universe and left everything else to chance. However, Allah, according to the Quran, is not indifferent, detached, or impersonal, as you know. The Quran describes Allah as the most gracious and the most merciful being in existence. Allah is portrayed as personal and active, promising, quote, "We will, without a doubt, help our apostles and those who believe in this world's life and on the day when the witnesses will stand forth." Surah 40:51. So let's take a look at the world and see if an absolutely benevolent being is consistent with what we find. Here's 10 arguments or lines of evidence that I think are better explained by the absence of Allah than by the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the physical forces that cause natural disasters. Planet Earth moves, erupts, splits, grinds, heaves, and demolishes people, cities, children, animals, anything and everything, and does not care. Just this last year in January, an earthquake hit Port-au-Prince, Haiti, ravaging a place and people already besieged by poverty and exploitation. More than 222,000 flesh and blood human beings perished. In 2004, an earthquake in the Indian Ocean created a tsunami that indiscriminately killed 230,000 men, women, and children in Sri Lanka. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and non-religious alike were decimated. We know that these are just numbers, and we have no way of fully comprehending the magnitude of these kinds of figures. The greatest number of people that any of us have ever seen in a single place is probably at a sports stadium. Consider Angel Stadium. Angel Stadium has a maximum capacity of 45,050. The number of people that died in these 2 earthquakes alone is not just 1 or 2 or 5, but more than 10 stadiums jam-packed. These are not rare or isolated events in history. In fact, it's actually chock full of them, of similar tragedies. There are a number of the numbers are astronomical for floods, for avalanches, for blizzards, cyclones, droughts, and famine, storms, tornadoes, tsunamis, volcanoes, even lakes kill people. Putting it all together, just since the first century, well over 180 million human beings have been killed by natural disasters. This is not just 100 or 200 stadiums, but 4,005 stadiums filled to max capacity. Remember, we can't blame human free will for these. Surely Allah could have created a world without such forces that cause natural disasters. In fact, the idea of future paradise within the Islamic tradition demonstrates that it's possible. Surely, if Allah exists, the death and devastation caused by natural disasters is absolutely baffling. However, if Allah does not exist, such natural disasters are no less tragic, but at least we can explain them. They are the products of mindless forces like plate tectonics and tropical weather systems operating in a universe blind and indifferent to our struggle for survival. Thus, the pitiless forces that produce natural disasters are strong evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for tumors, genetic disorders, mutations, diseases, illnesses, and infections. Consider Wang Chun-sai. He has a terrible case of neurofibromatosis. Wang's face was covered with massive tumors weighing a total of 50 pounds. They have stunted his growth, left his bones undeveloped, caused his spine to buckle, restrict his breathing, a life-crippling condition that has prevented Wang from leaving his small village. Consider cancer, leukemia, breast cancer, colon cancer, the list goes on and on and on. This year, about 569,490 Americans are expected to die of cancer, more than 1,500 people a day. Consider genetic disorders and mutations like Tay-Sachs, an autosomal recessive genetic disorder. Precious infants become blind, deaf, and unable to swallow. Muscles begin to atrophy and paralysis sets in. Death usually occurs before the age of 4. We could also look at cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, cleft palate, conjoined twins, and literally hundreds of others. Diseases, illnesses, and infections. We can talk about AIDS, we can talk about tuberculosis, we can talk about the bubonic plague, influenza, malaria, measles, smallpox. If we combine these pandemics and diseases, we have over 1,060,000,000 deaths. This is not just 100 stadiums, not 1,000, not even 10,000, but 22,529.5 stadiums. We haven't even touched on the millions that die from lower respiratory infections, diarrhea, whooping cough, tetanus, meningitis. I can't ever say this word. Meningitis. I even have a note here. I can never pronounce that word. Yellow fever and typhoid fever. Nor have we mentioned a variety of psychological and emotional disorders that may not be fatal but cause an enormous amount of turmoil and suffering. If Allah exists, the misery and destruction caused by all these afflictions has to remain incomprehensible and virtually inexplicable. On the other hand, supposing the absence of a caring God like Allah, combined with blind, impersonal, competing natural forces that have no regard for human life, it makes sense. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the presence of excessive, unjustified, or what is called gratuitous pain and suffering in the world. I'm not talking about the pain we can learn from, like touching a hot stove and you burn yourself and you learn something valuable, or the pain that can lead to a greater good, like a root canal. You know, we go to the dentist and we have a root canal, and obviously it's painful, but it's for our own good. There is no way a God who, according to a saying of Muhammad, is more merciful to his creatures than a mother to her child, would allow needless anguish like the intolerable pain felt by most people suffering from terminal advanced cancer. There is no justification for they're going to die anyway. Why should they continue to experience pain? As caring, compassionate human beings, we do all we can to ease this kind of suffering with the limited means available to us. If Allah exists, He is said to be more caring and compassionate than we, and has a much greater ability to alleviate pain. Since we could not be morally superior to a morally perfect God, we would expect Allah to also do something to ease the entirely unnecessary pain of advanced cancer victims, but He doesn't. If Allah exists, then gratuitous pain and suffering cannot. There must be some ultimate justification, but Allah hasn't shared it with us, and those speaking on Allah's behalf have not figured it out yet. In contrast, if Allah does not exist, we have an explanation. The sensation of pain evolved naturally as our body's way of warning us when something's wrong. But since evolution isn't a thoughtful and considerate process, it never figured out a way to turn the pain off when there was no more need of a warning. Thus, the absence of Allah is compatible with unjustifiable pain and suffering, and because unjustifiable pain and suffering exist, the existence of gratuitous suffering in the world is evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the silence of God in the face of adversity. Consider Saba Abu Halima. In December of 2009, in the midst of the slaughter of 1,400 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in what Israel termed Operation Cast Lead, bombshells containing internationally banned white phosphorus dropped from the sky and into her home. After one hit her home, her husband, Sa'ad Allah, gathered 4 of their children around him, and they ran to another part of the house. A second shell then hit their living room, killing her husband, Sa'ad Allah, and her 3 boys, Abdul Rahim, age 14, Zaid, age 10, and Hamza, age 8. Another shell then landed, knocking Saba to the ground. She says, quote, "I fell on the ground and there was a fire. The room was full of smoke and it smelled very bad. 3 times I heard my daughter say, 'Mama, Mama, Mama,' but I couldn't see her." Her 15-month-old daughter, Shahid, then collapsed and died. She herself suffered severe burns to her right arm, abdomen, left leg, and her feet, burns which doctors said appeared to be consistent with the illegal white phosphorus. Why would Allah allow this for one of his devoted followers? Saba Abu Halima is not alone. There are literally thousands and upon thousands with similar stories. Whether we're talking about the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Afghanistan, or Iraq, we can ask, and we should ask, where is Allah? Child soldiers. There are more than 300,000 children right now that are denied a childhood and often subjected to horrific violence, many witnessing the rape and murder of their mothers, along with the beatings and executions of their fathers. They are forced into more than 30 armed conflicts worldwide, conscripted into combat, often sent into minefields ahead of older troops, and sometimes used for suicide missions. Young girls are often raped or given to military commanders as wives. Sometimes they are forced to commit atrocities against their own families or neighbors in order to ensure they are never able to return to their home community. Surely many of them feel abandoned by God, and if not, in all honesty, they should. Human trafficking, slavery. It is estimated that there are more than 27 million slaves in the world today, more than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Recently, 168 children between the ages of 7 and 15 were kidnapped or purchased by gang members in Romania and smuggled to Great Britain in order to beg and steal. Many of them were mutilated and disabled on purpose in order to evoke more sympathy from passerbys. Sex trafficking. Lured by false promises of jobs, thousands are forced to sleep with the upwards of 20 men a day at $20 apiece. $3 is given to them to pay off some so-called debt that they supposedly owe. Every 30 seconds, a woman or child becomes a victim. Child mortality. In 2009, 8.1 million children died before their 5th birthday. About 33,000 children die each and every day. Half of these because of malnutrition, the lack of safe drinking water, and sanitation. Many just need a mosquito net to prevent the spread of disease. One child every 5 seconds dies as a result of hunger. That's 700 every hour, 16,000 a day, 6 million a year. If God is not answering the prayers of thousands of praying mothers around the world, whose prayers are being answered? What can I ask is more sincere and devout than a mother praying for her dying child? All of this without even mentioning those who have no one to pray for them, like the many feral children, often abandoned or abused by parents, like Danny, who for the first 7 years of her life never saw the sun, felt the breeze, tasted food, kept in an apartment closet her entire life with urine and feces, dog and cat and human excrement smeared on the walls, mashed into the carpet, legions of roaches, everything dank and rotting. When she was found, she could only crawl, growl, and bark like a dog. She will likely never fully recover. Why does Allah not intercede? Is it possible to think God is helping college students find parking spots and pass their exams, hearing runny noses, helping us find our lost pets, giving our planes safe flights, but not helping the thousands of amputees, paraplegics, and more than 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5 who died because of economic sanctions under Clinton? We are so fast to give Allah the green light, the get-out-of-jail-free card. He can do no wrong. Why are humans that have the power to stop this responsible, but God is not? Often, think about, those that are getting in their cars in the morning and they have a child that is maybe riding a little bike behind their vehicle, and as they back out of the car, you're the next door neighbor, and you see this happening. Would it not be incumbent on you to say something, to do something, to get the person to stop driving before they kill their child? And it happens all the time. All I would have to do is tap them on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, you're about to back over your child." And that would be it. The child would be saved. But he doesn't. Why should God get the credit when things go right, but not the blame when things go wrong? I can remember my cousin Jack telling me, when people go to the doctors, if the surgery goes well, they praise God, for a successful surgery. But if it goes bad, the person dies, they blame the doctors. There seems to be a double standard that's applied. I think we need to be more consistent. Now, it may be objected that many people have felt God's comforting presence or experienced answered prayers during adversity. But isn't it possible that the people who believe they have experienced God are mistaken about the source of that comfort? Of course it is. We all know that the mere idea of a God acting as a placebo could help believers through adversity without God ever truly existing. Consequently, both the absence of Allah and the existence of Allah can explain claims of feeling God's comforting presence equally well. But this is not true when it comes to explaining instances where Allah's comfort isn't felt. Only the absence of Allah has a sufficient answer for that. Thus, Allah's silence in the face of adversity, including child soldiers, slavery, human trafficking, the sex trade, and child mortality, is a significant problem for the existence of Allah, which asserts that Allah cares, helps, and embodies mercy and compassion. But it is strong evidence for the absence of Allah. This leads to what we might call the hiddenness of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for this. If Allah exists and wants His existence to be known, then isn't it strange that the evidence for His existence isn't stronger? Many religionists, including some Muslims, act as though God's existence were utterly obvious, and that if you deny it, you have a dark heart, a rebellious nature, or a moral problem of some sort. Even though millions despise Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mubarak, Bush, or even Obama, not a single person I have ever met denied their existence. It would be different if someone could say, "Come with me, Dan. Let me introduce you to Allah. Allah, this is Dan. Dan, this is Allah." If it were this obvious, then we could scorn those who denied His existence. But we cannot meet, shake the hand of, see, audibly hear, physically touch, or empirically verify Allah in any human and sensorial way. And this utterly abolishes the force of any claim that this personal entity exists. Some claim He is present through holy texts. But why would God communicate through ancient literature written in a language only a fraction of humanity can read, much less understand, given the lack of contextual clues in the Quran necessary to accurately interpret ancient literature? Couldn't He at least provided a DVD? Few things seem more odd and plain, bizarre than God writing books. Just talk to us like I'm talking to you tonight. We all have ears. If Allah does not exist, the reason for God's hiddenness is quite clear. He's simply not there. Thus, divine hiddenness is evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of a God like Allah that is supposedly everywhere. Moving on, the absence of Allah offers the best explanation of religious history. If it were true that Allah has revealed Himself through Islam, then would we not expect the religion's success? Would we expect the religion's success to be explicable through natural means? But rather would expect the religion to display unique and undeniable signs of divine favor. However, the religion spread like the majority of other religions by word of mouth, cultural diffusion, conquered territory, and religious rule. Losing military excursions like the Battle of Tours to the Christians in 732 are the kind of things that slowed Islam down. There's no clear, observable, noticeable difference between the success, failure, or hardship of Muslims and any other religious or non-religious people group. Muslims die of cancer, AIDS, heart disease, and car crashes in a way that is indistinguishable from every other religious or non-religious tradition. They suffer from Alzheimer's, economic peril, all the same. Muslims, like other people, win some wars and lose others. Many Muslims, along with other religious and non-religious people in the world today, suffer the heavy hand of Western hegemony. But, go Egypt. They're doing something very, very amazing right now. Again, there is no unmistakable signs of divine guidance, protection, or help. Now, if Allah existed, we would not expect Him to have sat idly by and allowed historical contingencies to determine the success of the truth. Instead, Allah should have intervened to give clear, unmistakable signs that Islam is the true religion. However, there is no God. There would be no religion that displays evidence of God's favor, and indeed, there is not. Related to this, the absence of Allah offers the best explanation for religious confusion. If Allah exists, we would expect that He would have made the path He desires for His followers to take clear and obvious, so that we could have no confusion about it. In fact, it would seem that doing so would be Allah's moral duty, especially since there are unspeakable severe consequences for choosing the wrong path. However, consider the rich and incompatible diversity of religious claims made worldwide. There are hundreds of religions and even more sects and denominations. Christianity alone has 33,000 different denominations. Even Islam experienced mass confusion when Muhammad died and there was no clear successor. Thus we have the Sunnis and the Shia. In the 11th century, during the Abbasid period, Islamic elites were split into two more factions: the Mutazilites, who believed goodness existed independent of God's judgment, and the Asharites, who believed God defined and determined it. The religious landscape is hopelessly confused and cluttered by conflicting holy books, religious authorities, conflicting opinions about God and the supernatural. However, if Allah is absent, then there is no truth in the God hypothesis for believers to discover. There's no reason to expect them to agree about any of it. There is no God to settle disputes or offer to find favor to any group of believers. Therefore, the multiplicity of conflicting religious ideologies in the world is evidence for the absence of Allah and against the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for predation. Why would an intelligent, designing, and benevolent deity create a world in which the food for living sentient beings is quite often other living sentient beings? Why do many animals have to eat others in order to survive? Why would Allah create humans as edible beings, beings that can be eaten? Surely Allah is not edible, he can't be eaten. Why would Allah create animals as beings that needed to eat in the first place? Why not base sustainability on photosynthesis or on chemosynthesis or some other divine mechanism to avoid the predator-prey dynamic? In any respect, the daily routine of life on earth is a continual bloodbath of fear, hunting, being hunted, combat, suffering, and death. Every moment of every day, it's business as usual for animals to be eaten alive, narrowly escape, or even have their internal organs devoured from within by parasites. Some wasps, after paralyzing their victim, inject their eggs into its body, converting it into an incubation chamber for their offspring. As the larva develops, it slowly eats its living host from the inside out. And we've all seen zebras on Animal Planet, right? Zebras on Animal Planet still alive as lions devour their entrails. Will Allah take credit for this? Who wants to be known as the architect of the crocodile's jaws, the teeth of a great white, or the venom of snakes? How could the sin of an ancient ancestor have anything to do with the speed of a cheetah? That thing was not built to outrun orange trees. Moreover, how do we watch a clan of chimps bite and tear to pieces another chimp because it happened to wander into their territory, and then persuade ourselves that this is the handiwork of intelligence and compassion? The absence of Allah means that no personal being is responsible for such brutal conditions. Only that is the result of mindless natural forces and a struggle to survive. The bloody and ruthless predation that occurs each day is inexplicable should we postulate a life-respecting deity that created it. Therefore, predation constitutes strong evidence for the absence of Allah and evidence against the existence of Allah. The absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the random and chaotic movements in space that make the universe almost completely inhospitable to life. The observable universe, you know, is a dreadfully dangerous place. From the vacuum of space itself to solar flares, radiation, extreme temperatures, reckless asteroids, black holes, supernovas, there's hardly a single place or refuge for life. Even in our relatively calm Earth and life-sponsoring solar system, rocks, moons, planets, asteroids, and comets are all aimlessly speeding around the sun in varying orbits that oftentimes overlap and intersect. You may have noticed that our moon is heavily scarred, nearly completely covered with craters, such as a result of countless pointless impacts. There's also the massive asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It's either the leftover rock that did not form into planets, or it's a product of planets smashing into each other at some point in the solar system's past. What is its purpose? It is beyond difficult to reconcile why a God of order and precision designed space to contain ice and rocks, erratically flying around only to slam into the moon, each other, Earth, or whatever else with no particular purpose. If Allah exists, it makes sense that an impersonal and mechanistic universe would be this unsympathetic towards life. It makes more sense that humans adapted to the earth, not the other way around. Our planet was not made for or with humans in mind. Thus, the hostility in the universe towards life, including the random and chaotic movements of objects in space, is evidence for the absence of Allah and against the idea that Allah exists, which presumes an ordered, purposeful, life-designing, and life-giving deity. I have one more argument, for the sake of time I'll skip it. So to conclude, the absence of Allah offers the best explanation for the physical forces that cause natural disasters, for tumors, genetic disorders, mutations, diseases, illnesses, and infections. It offers the best explanation for the presence of excessive, unjustified, gratuitous pain and suffering. It offers the best explanation for the silence of God in the face of adversity. the hiddenness of God, the ordinariness of religious history, religious confusion, predation, hostility in the universe towards life, and the argument that I skipped, which is the poor designs and flaws of evolution, which I'll touch on later. In essence, the idea that Allah exists must create cognitive dissonance by asserting attributes of God that make absolutely no sense given the data we have about life on this planet. So I am compelled to ask, if this isn't what a world would look like if there was not a God, what is? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. For those of you who are keeping up with the time limit, we've actually changed the time limit to 30 minutes instead. Because Dan had actually prepared a lot more than that, but unfortunately we weren't able to give him more time, so we apologize for that. So now we have Hamza, who's going to be giving his 30 minutes, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Brothers and sisters and friends, I greet you the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's great being here again, thoroughly jet lagged, but Jazakallah for the invite, and I thank Dan and everybody else for being positive participants in a hopefully fruitful and engaging discussion. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not American, I'm British. Okay, so thank you for, again, welcoming me to your homeland. I don't want to address any of Dan's points. I want to leave that to the rebuttals, because I just want to build a positive case for why we as Muslims believe in the existence of God, believe in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because I believe that Dan's case is a thoroughly emotional case. For example, if I question my father and I say to my father, why are you my father? Or how did you become my father? If I can't answer any of these, or based upon my inductions of my father's behavior, does it mean that my father doesn't exist? No, it doesn't. Rather, there are useful questions we can talk about, and we can have a healthy discussion on the whyness and the howness of my father's behavior, or him being that he is, but it doesn't negate the very fact that he exists. Also, Dan's argument has an assumption that the God we're talking about is a very Christian-centric type of God, because some of these arguments he posed are actually reconciled with a conception of God in Islam called Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something which I'm going to elaborate on during my rebuttal stage. So let's first and foremost talk about, are there any good reasons to believe in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, first and foremost, I think there are very good reasons to believe in the existence of Allah, the existence of God. Now this may seem like a surprise to many atheists, theists, or people who are agnostic in nature, but this is not the case at all, and this resonates in the Time magazine. When it was published in 1980, there was a major story entitled Modernizing the Case for God, and it said, God is making a comeback. Most intriguingly, this is happening not among theologians or ordinary believers, but in the crisp intellectual circles of academic philosophers. In this slide, I'm going to argue there's good reasons to believe in the existence of Allah based on two simple arguments. One, the beginning of the universe, and two, the miraculous nature of the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims. But before we get into that discussion, we have to talk about what do we mean by reasonable? What do we mean by rational? Now, I could get into a lengthy philosophical discussion about empiricism versus rationalism, a priori, a posteriori, and all these words that only probably me and Dan know about, right? I want to give you a crude but useful example to show why we need to use our rational faculties to come to these conclusions, and not just rely solely on emotion. Imagine every single one of you are at home. And imagine the time is midnight, and you can't sleep. You have jet lag just like me. And all of a sudden, someone knocks on the door. You don't know who's there. So it's like, who is it? They're not answering. So you walk to the door and you look through the spyglass. And lo and behold, there's a man with his red underpants. Okay? And he says, hello, darling, assuming I'm a woman. I want to check your gas meter. Everyone know what a gas meter is? Good. We have many of those in Britain. It's too cold. Good. Thank you, sir. How would you reply? How would you reply to this gentleman? Are you going to say, yeah, come on in. Please come. Please do so. No, you're going to be like, wait a minute. Is the gas man really that crazy that he's just going to come to my door with red underpants? Is he going to come at 12 o'clock at night? Midnight? Have they changed the uniform policy? So you're going to ask all these type of questions because you're going to use your common sense, your logic, your rational faculties to come to a conclusion. And hopefully, and I would suggest that our conclusion would be 911. Okay, that's the rational conclusion. So if we use these God-given aspects, these reflective aspects, these rational faculties, reason and logic, I would argue that we'll have very good reason to believe in the existence of Allah. And to take the atheist route would be equivalent of allowing a man who's with underpants to come to your house at 12 o'clock at night to check your gas meter. So let me go straight to the first argument. God makes sense of the beginning of the universe. God makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, we have all asked the same question. Why does something exist rather than nothing? Even the famous German polymath, Leibniz, he wrote in his essay, why does something exist rather than nothing? Even the Quran, the book of the Muslims, says, or do they think the universe came out of nothing? Now, how can we respond to this perennial question? How do we respond? Well, typically, and this is not all atheists, but some atheists like Bertrand Russell in 1964 during a radio program, he said, well, you know what? The universe is just there, and that's all. Just forget about it. It's a phenomenon. Just leave it alone. It's just there, okay? But that is highly problematic, because if the universe was just there, that would suggest that the universe has an eternal past, has an infinite past, has an infinite set of historical events. Now, can this be the case? Can we have an infinite set of historical events? No, we can't. And the reason we can't, because the concept, the idea of the infinity cannot exist in the real world. It exists in a mathematical world with assumptions, axioms, and conventions, but you can't export the idea into the real world. The philosophers say there's no ontological export into the real world. It's a big word, you don't have to remember it, but the point I'm trying to say here, infinity doesn't make sense in the real world. Let me give you some examples. Example number one. Say we have an infinite number of Professor Dans in the room. And I take 5 professors away. How many professors do we have left? Someone answer me, please. Infinity. Or someone may say, well, infinity minus 5. If we take any of those answers, we should be able to practically count how many professors there are in the room. But we can't. So it leads to paradoxes and absurdities in the real world. Now imagine we have 100 professors in the room. And at every possible moment, we want to add another professor. Professor 101. Professor 1001. Professor 1,000,001. And we go on and on and on. Am I ever going to reach an amount that we could describe as infinite? Of course not. Like my father said one day over a nice Greek coffee. Yes, I'm Greek, by the way. I know I look desi, but I'm Greek. Over a nice Greek coffee, he said, what about infinity plus 1? What he was trying to say was that there could be another moment that you could add another professor. So you never actualize the infinity. It will never exist into the real world. And in this light, mathematicians Kasman and Newman, they also said, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. And the famous German mathematician David Hilbert, he said, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. So let's go back to our question of an infinite universe with regards to historical events. Well, it can't be the case because events are real. Therefore, the series of events in the past cannot go back forever. So it logically follows that the universe began to exist at a point in time. And this is supported by astrophysical evidence, scientific evidence. For example, has everyone heard of the Big Bang? Put your hands up. Good. It's not that thing that happens after too many curries, okay? The Big Bang, according to cosmologists, say that physical time and space were created and matter and energy were created at a point called singularity. As the scientist P.C.W. Davies, he says, for this reason, most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event. The creation not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but also of time and space itself. Similarly, John Boslow, the author of Stephen Hawking's universe, he states, the biggest misunderstanding about the Big Bang is that it began as a lump of matter somewhere in the void of space. It was not just matter that was created during the Big Bang, it was space and time that were created. So in the sense that time has a beginning, space also has a beginning. But if you really reflect on this, this would imply that a proponent of the Big Bang, or the hot standard model of the Big Bang, would mean that something came out of nothing. But I'll ask you a question. Can something come out of nothing? No, because out of nothing, nothing comes. This is why P.J. Swart, in his publication about time, says, if there is anything we can find inconceivable, it is that something could arise from nothing. And let me summarize this argument. 1, whatever begins to exist as a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. So what is 3? What logically follows? The universe has a... Good, everyone's awake. However, this argument doesn't prove the existence of God. It doesn't prove that Allah exists, or is God, or Jesus, or Buddha, or any of the 3,800 terms or labels for God that we've been arguing about since 6,000 BC Sumeria. We've been arguing about God for centuries, thousands of years. God knows. So the point I'm trying to make is that we just know there is a cause. However, upon thinking about this cause, we can come to some striking conclusions, some startling conclusions. And this thinking is something that I call conceptual analysis. Let's analyze what this cause can be. Now, since this cause of the universe created time and space, it must be one. The reason it must be one, because if we follow the philosophical principle of Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor means do not multiply entities beyond necessity. In basic terms, it means, look, have the most simplest explanation. Because if you have a more complex explanation, you'll have more questions than you've answered. So the best explanation is the simplest explanation, and with regards to the cause of the universe, we say it is one. Think about it, it's like a knocking on the door. Someone knocks on the door, you don't assume now it's LA Galaxy soccer team, all 11 players including Beckham. You don't assume that, do you? You say someone is knocking on the door, the most simplest explanation. 2, this cause must be uncaused, because there's an absurdity of an infinite regress of causes. What does this mean? It means that it doesn't make sense that all the causes go down a chain that could be described as infinite. Let me give an example. Say I want to throw the microphone at Amir, for example, right? Now, in order for me to throw the microphone, I have to ask Dan, can I throw the microphone? And Dan says, let me speak for you, I do apologize. Dan says, no, because I have to ask Mufti Saab. Mustafa, sorry. Apologies. We have to ask Imam Mustafa for permission too. And he says, well, I can't do that either, because it goes on and on and on. Am I ever going to throw the microphone at Amir? No. And this also answers in my view, the shallow atheist counter-argument of who created God? Because that's the equivalent of saying, who caused the cause for the universe? Well, what stops us from continuing and saying, well, who caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause for the universe? Let's add another cause. And who caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause for the universe? Well, let's carry on. Then who caused the cause? That caused the cause, that caused the cause. Anyone be rapping, yeah? Bo, yeah? So that's the whole issue here. That couldn't go forever because we will never have the universe in the first place. The question of who caused God or who caused the cause for the universe denies the very existence of the universe in the first place. 3, this cause must be immaterial and transcendent. The reason I'm saying this is because since it created time and space, it must therefore transcend time and space. In other words, it exists atemporally and non-spatially, not within space. And the logical conclusion is that this cause must be therefore immaterial because all material things exist within time and space. 4th, and this is very significant, this cause must have a will, meaning it must have an ability to have a relationship with things. Now why am I saying this? Because if this cause is uncaused, therefore eternal, and it brought to existence the universe that had a beginning, it means it chose the universe to come to existence. And choice indicates a will, and a will indicates it can have a relationship with beings such as humans. Now, upon conceptual analysis, we got some striking conclusions, which is in line with the Islamic conception of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As God says in the Quran, in the most eloquent way, in the 112th chapter, say, He is Allah, the one and only, Allah the eternal, the absolute. He begets not, nor is He begotten, and there is none like unto Him. So what does this mean? He's immaterial, He's one, He's eternal, and there is nothing like unto Him. What we've discovered just by using our rational faculties that the Quran tells us to use. For example, the Quran says, يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for those who reflect. And يَتَفَكَّرُونَ actually means something very profound. It means the thing that you're reflecting upon, you must inquire about its implications. What does it mean that there's a beginning of the universe? Don't be a desert romantic. Don't just touch the sand and look at the stars. Think about things very deeply. So we can conclude safely that the existence of Allah is a reasonable conclusion. Now, we could also know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists based upon the fact that His book, called the Quran, the Revelation, is actually a miracle. Now, before we get into this, we have to first discuss what miracles are. Well, the traditional philosophical view of miracles were violations of natural law. I disagree with this description. I disagree with this definition. Why? Because what are natural laws? Natural laws are just generalizations of patterns we perceive in the universe. Just because something has changed from the pattern doesn't mean it's a miracle. Maybe we haven't been looking hard enough. Maybe we haven't been thinking hard enough. The point is that's not a very good definition of what a miracle is. So I suggest a new definition is required, which is more coherent. And I would argue that if we define a miracle as an act of impossibility, then it shows to us that the existence of Allah or God is reasonable. Why am I saying this? Because when we go to the natural world and we exhaust all logical, naturalistic possibilities and we can't find an answer, then it's a signpost to the transcendent. It's a signpost to Allah. And let me give you some examples with regards to the Quran. The Quran is a miracle based on 3 features. There's many features, but I'm going to discuss 3. 1, linguistic, 2, historical, and 3, scientific. Now, with regards to linguistic, we know, and not just we as Muslims, but many Western scholars like Bruce Lawrence, Neil Robinson, and many others, that the Quran is not only a linguistic beauty, but it has linguistic inimitability. What does this mean? It means that not only does the Quran move men to tears and ecstasy, but rather the structure of the language, the uniqueness of the Quran, descopes the Arabic language. Okay? And this is based upon observable features. It's not like Shakespeare, for example, that is subjective. Do I like Shakespeare or not? I love Shakespeare, for example. To be or not to be. Oh, Romeo, Romeo. Wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father, deny thy name. We could even Islamize that and say, oh Abdullah. Deny thy mother. Yeah? For example, yeah? So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not based upon the literary features, the eloquence. is based upon the structural features of the language. Because every time someone tries to produce something in Arabic, it sits in certain structural forms, prose, poetry, etc., etc. But the Quran is a distinct structural feature. And the reason we say it's a miracle, because when we go to the nature of the miracle, which is the Arabic language, which is 28 letters, finite grammatical rules, and we exhaust all possibilities, we cannot create the structure of the Quran. So what does this mean? It means it's an act of impossibility. Because we've gone to all possible explanations and exhausted them, and yet we can't find an explanation for the uniqueness of the Quran. And it is no wonder the famous British translator and Orientalist Foster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, he said, and that though several attempts have been made to produce a work equal to it, as elegant writing is concerned, none has yet succeeded. Also, Professor Bruce Lawrence of Duke University, in his book, The Quran, a Biography, states, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning, layered within meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Let's go to the second feature, historical. Now, the Quran mentions many historical facts, and it mentions narratives of the stories of the prophets and what happened to civilizations before us. But it also mentions very minute details. And let's take one detail into consideration. And this detail is the description of the leader of the Egyptians. There's two types of description. Malik, the king, Fir'aun, the pharaoh. And there are two distinct definitions of descriptions at two different points of time. For example, the Quran mentions the king, Malik, in the time of Joseph alayhi salam. And also, the title of Pharaoh is used with who? Moses alayhi salam. Why are there distinct definitions or descriptions of the leader of the pharaohs at two distinct times? Because when we go to history, any basic book on history with regards to the Egyptians, we come to realize, as a result of translating the hieroglyphics, that you know what? The Egyptians called the leader of the Egyptians in two different ways, in specific times that are in line with the Quranic narrative of Yusuf alayhi salam and Moses alayhi salam. Now I ask, how did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam have come with this information when he was illiterate? And to assume that he knew this information would mean that he had access to hieroglyphics and can translate them. But the Rosetta Stone came way after. Significantly, brothers, sisters, and friends, the Orientalists have claimed that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ copied from the Bible and the Torah, because these were the books that spoke about the Egyptians. Well, let's go to these books. Funny enough, they only mention Pharaoh. They don't mention the description as a king. So would that mean the Prophet ﷺ copied from the Bible and the Torah, knew what was wrong, corrected it, and then inserted it in the Quran? Surely this would mean that he had a library of Alexandrian magnitude. And we know this was not the case. So I would argue that in this light, how could the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ have known such minute historical detail, especially when all other source texts and historical texts available at the time, including the Bible, did not mention this? Since people at the time of Revelation did not know this information, what does it say about the authorship of the Quran? A question for you. Let's go to the third feature, scientific. Now the Quran mentions many things about natural phenomena, about the stars, the orbits, the universe, the cosmos. But it also mentions about mountains. And in two different places the Quran says, we place firmly embedded mountains on the earth so we would not move under them. And in another place the Quran says, have we not made the earth as a bed and mountains as its pegs? Now this has only been understood in the 20th century. Because what the Quran describes is that the mountains have root-like structures, peg-like structures. And when we go to the book Earth by Dr. Frank Press, we understand that mountains have roots 10 to 15 times the size of the mountain above the earth. And it acts in a way that is described by geologists as isostasis, which means it prevents the earth from moving more than it does. We know there's earthquakes, but it prevents the excessive movement that would happen in absence of these peg-like structures. And the Quran details this in not an ambiguous way. It details them in a very clear manner. How can the Prophet ﷺ have known this type of information? It's almost impossible. Because the science at the time was so primitive, they thought the only function of the mountains was to keep the sky up. So again, how do we explain this in light of the fact that this is relatively recent science, with no one at the time of revelation knowing this information, or even remotely having the possible technology to acquire such knowledge? What does this tell you about the author? And this is very important for us to take into consideration. Very important. Because again, when we go to the naturalistic explanations, we go into history, let's go into history. We go into language, let's go into the Arabic language. We go into science, let's go into science and the history of science. And we exhaust all possible explanations, we don't find an adequate explanation. So what does this do? It's a signpost to the transcendent. It's a signpost to a supernatural explanation, which is best explained by the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, on my final 3 minutes, I want to conclude with an emotional argument. I would say that life, brothers and sisters, and listen very carefully, turn your internal radios off. Because everyone's got an internal radio, always judging what other people have to say. Oh, he thinks he's too smart, he thinks he's funny, blah, blah, blah. Just turn it off, okay? And just listen to what I'm trying to say. Life is absurd without the existence of Allah. First and foremost, there is no ultimate meaning in life. If our ends are the same and we just pass out of existence, what does it mean to exist in the first place? Does it matter if we ever existed at all? If the universe never existed, what difference would it make? The universe is doomed to destruction one day. As Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, he wished that the universe never existed, and he wrote an essay on suicide. What about ultimate value? There's no ultimate value. There's only subjective value, but not ultimate value. If our lives really end in the grave, does it matter if I was a saint and you were a devil? Does it really matter when we're going to be worms meat? Does it really matter? Also, in absence of Allah, then our morality is subjective. It's relative. Because Allah, or the concept of God, is the only idea that transcends human subjectivity. In absence of God, the only foundation for morality is evolution or social pressure. And these things are changing, therefore would render our morals to change. Just look at the past 30 years, for example. Finally, there's no ultimate purpose in life. There's no ultimate purpose. We may want to create purpose for ourselves, but that's a self-delusion. Because the atheist would say, wait a minute, there's no real purpose in life, but create purpose for yourself. But I think it's just self-delusional. Why is it self-delusional, brothers and sisters and friends? It's because you attribute purpose to yourself, but for your very existence, there is no purpose at all. This is why the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, this world is based on nothing. And in order to create purpose for yourself, you must believe that everything is meaningless if you want to be consistent with your philosophical view. Now, I would argue as well that even when Richard Dawkins says our only purpose is to propagate DNA, and if that's the only purpose that we have, to propagate our DNA, then what does it mean to be a human being? And I would also argue in a humorous way, then he could never point the finger at the Muslims who have a polygamous tradition. Because that's propagating DNA, right? Penny hasn't dropped? No? It is no wonder God says in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اسْتَجِيبُوا لِلَّهِ وَلِرُسُولِهِ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُمْ. Let's do that again. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اسْتَجِيبُوا لِلَّهِ وَلِرُسُولِهِ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُمْ. O you who believe, respond to the call of God, of Allah and His Messenger, to that which gives us life. Because I think if you respond to the atheist call, do we really have a life, or is it self-delusion? That's the question we need to think about. Now, brothers and friends, as I said in the rebuttal stage, I'm going to detail my response to the problem of evil, because Dan's argument can be described as the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. I have an argument for that, but I want to bring the case for the existence of God, a cogent case, a positive case, to show, you know what, if we use our reason, our logic, we'll be able to understand by the beginning of the universe, by the miraculous nature of the Quran, that actually the existence of Allah really makes sense. Thank you very much for listening. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.
7-minute rebuttal, by Dan.
Well, I was actually quite surprised that Hamza didn't bring more evidence for the existence of Allah. He acknowledged that his first argument actually wasn't existence for the Allah, but just the existence of something that started everything. He asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's a profound question, one that I think is actually impossible to answer. And I think I would say we can summarize Hamza's arguments this evening as really what's called in philosophy the God of the gaps. In other words, if we don't have an explanation, then God did it. And I think this goes back early on in humanity's existence when, we saw lightning and thunder, and we were scared of these natural events. We didn't know what was causing them. And so we imagine that there must be something in control of the lightning, the thunder, and the rain, where we need crops to eat. And so in order for us to be we want to be on the good side of whatever this is that's in control of the rain. And ultimately, for instance, the rainbow. We didn't know what explained the rainbow, so we thought God, laid this rainbow out in the sky. But there's actually today we know there are natural explanations for these things. So I would say we should hesitate to put a deity when we don't know. It's a lot better to say I don't know rather than to, every time there's a gap of knowledge, put God there. Because as we evolve, we gain more and more understanding. Science explains more and more things. So rather than place God there, I think we need to follow the evidence, which is, or at least to say we don't know. Hamza said, he used the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. There are multiple problems and ambiguities in this argument. What is meant by the term begin? Begin is something coming from nothing, or begin as in, already existing matter changing form. As far as science is concerned, nothing actually absolutely began to exist, for matter cannot be created or destroyed. I can, burn up this mantle right here, and we'd have ashes. And I can hit it with a hammer, we can put it through a grinder, but there's always going to be something there. The matter cannot be destroyed. And in like manner, science says matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so actually, when Bertrand Russell says, matter always existed, that's as far as science has come. Even if we accept, let's see here, matter is eternal and is not in need of an Aristotelian first cause. If we accept that God formed and shaped the universe, we have to ask, what caused God? Even if we accept there's a first cause, there's no necessity to identify it with God, especially any particular God, say Allah. Can we have an infinite set of past events? The problem is that this is exactly what he's proposing for Allah. The idea that Allah is eternal is an infinite regress backwards as well. So he has the same problem to explain. If there's a problem with the eternality of matter, the same problem applies to the eternality of Allah. However, we know that matter exists and that it cannot be created or destroyed. We don't know that God exists, which is why believers around the world need faith. Hamza says that the Big Bang Theory claims that something came from nothing. This is what logicians refer to as a straw man argument. He misrepresents the Big Bang Theory because according to the original theory and modern science, the pre-existing universe expanded from an extremely dense and hot state and continues to expand today. In fact, it's going to expand to the point where we're going to have a freezing here on the planet. The sun will eventually burn out. It's actually dangerous. So although life on this earth is pleasant right now, eventually life will come to an end, as terrible as that might sound. I want to address his arguments regarding the Quran, which he said a miracle is an act of impossibility. Once we accept, the impossible, we can accept anything. It's impossible for it's impossible for there to be a square triangle. A triangle has 3 sides, a square has 4. And so we can say, Allah could make a square triangle, Allah can make a married bachelor. What would that mean? It's absolutely nonsense. Once we accept the impossible, we've lost our minds. We lose all sense of rationality. Once we accept contradictions, the impossible, we have no basis for any kind of reasonable discussion. And so he's actually saying a miracle is an act of impossibility. He said once we exhaust natural explanations, it's a sign of Allah. If we've exhausted natural explanations, we've exhausted natural explanations. Again, we don't want to use the God of the gaps and just place something in its place when we don't have an understanding. As far as the Quran, he says the Quran is not subjective, that it's like Shakespeare. It's extremely subjective. Lots of people have different views about the Quran. Some people like the literature, some people don't like the literature. I wrote actually an entire critique on the Quran right here. I'm not going to have time tonight to go through my interpretation of the Quran and my critique of it. But if anyone's interested, I would gladly send it to you. But I'll go over a few things. The Quran, we can look at, I would say most importantly, let's look at the morality of the Quran. The Quran prescribes, as to the thief, male or female, this is a quote, cut off his or her hands, a punishment by way of example from Allah for their crime, and Allah is exalted in power. Is that what we should do with these? Should we cut off their hands? Or is that an excessive use of punishment, cruel and unusual punishment? The Quran's prescription for women who are guilty of some kinds of sexual sins, quote, if any of your women are guilty of lewdness, take the evidence of 4 reliable witnesses from among you and them, and if they testify, confine them to houses until death do claim them, or Allah ordain for them some other way. Another passage says, the women and man guilty of fornication flog each of them with 100 stripes. Let not compassion move you in your case, in a matter prescribed by Allah. If you believe in Allah on the last day, let a party of believers witness their punishment. Really? This is the embodiment of mercy and compassion? The very next verse prohibits those guilty of adultery or fornication from marrying anyone except other guilty individuals, guilty unbelievers. Look at the prescription in the Quran regarding hell and future punishment. Surah 4:56 says, those who reject our signs, we shall soon cast them to the fire. As often as their skins are roasted through, we shall change them for fresh skins, that they may taste the chastisement, for Allah is exalted in power and wise. God is saying he's going to melt off their skins, put new skins on just to melt them off again. What is more horrifying than that? What is less merciful than that? The Quran is obsessed with hell, fire, doom, and punishment, mentioning these concepts hundreds of times. For those willing to question the veracity of the Quran, like myself, Surah 40 says, they will have yokes and chains placed around their necks and dragged through stinky, boiling fluid while fires burn their bodies. Those who are thirsty will be given boiling water and hot as molten brass that will scald their faces and cut up their bowels to pieces. This doesn't sound like the work of a merciful, loving, compassionate, amazing deity. This sounds like something much different. And I would go on, but for lack of time, I appreciate you guys considering my thoughts this evening.
It was actually 8 minutes, so we'll give Hamza 8 minutes as well. Salatul Isha is going to be delayed a few minutes. We almost never ever do this, but we're going to make this one exception, inshallah.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, brothers and sisters. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First and foremost, see, again, I think what Dan is doing, he's assuming a Christian conception of God. See, we don't believe God is just merciful and just loving. We also believe that he's the one who punishes. He's the one who avenges, the one who's affirming punishment. But we also believe that he's the wise. He's Al-Wudud, which means the loving, the excessively loving. And we see all of his names and attributes in that holistic way via the concept of oneness. So obviously hell is not a nice place. Paradise is a big place, we want everybody there, but there are some metaphysical implications if we actively reject God's message. I don't see how that denies the existence of God. It denies the conception of who you think God is, but it's totally consistent with the paradigm in the Quran that mentions He's the loving, or He's also the one that punishes. But let me deal with his main argument, which was the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil can be summarized in the following way. 1, a good God exists that is omnipotent, is all-powerful. 2, evil and excessive suffering exists. 3, therefore a good God that is omnipotent doesn't really exist. Well, the first point we need to understand here that this is actually not true. The conclusion is not very sound because it assumes that God is only good and powerful. But in the Islamic tradition, this is why we need to read upon the Islamic conception of God if we're going to discuss, does Allah exist? Because in the Islamic conception of God, we believe He's the wise. So things that can happen ontologically, we believe that there's wisdom behind it. Now you may say, well, I can't see the wisdom. But it doesn't mean it's not there. That would be arguing from ignorance, which is a logical fallacy. You'd be arguing, well, as they say in Latin, is argumentum ad ignoration. But since there's wisdom there, then it deals with the problem logically. Also, we know that God's punishment could be a result of our sins. We also know that our primary purpose in life is not just to have a nice time. Dan wants paradise on earth. See, the atheist still wants a paradise. Yeah, we all do, of course. But there's a process of getting there. The process God has given us is a test in life. In the major chapters of the Quran, what does the Quran say? We're here to test you. We have created the world to test you in order for you to attain salvation. And this is a very key concept. The whole problem of evil assumes we're here to have a party. Do you see the point? Also, we have to understand that sometimes hardship and suffering enables us to realize who God is. For example, God in the Islamic tradition is the victorious and is the one that heals. And we believe the greater good is not going away from pain and suffering, but the greater good is knowing Allah, is knowing God. Significantly, brothers, sisters, and friends, we also know that God has given us free will, and free will includes choosing evil acts. And I know it doesn't deal with all of the evil arguments, but it deals with some of them. Now, the thing that really undermines his whole argument is this. I would ask, what do you mean by evil and suffering? Do they really exist? Oh, wait a minute, like objectively, like they're really real? Oh, if that's the case, then God must exist. Because to have an objective sense of any value, whether it's bad or evil, what I mean by objective, it transcends our human subjectivity. God must exist because God is the only concept that transcends our subjectivity. You may claim evolution is the foundation for objective anything. Well, it's not, because it states that we're just accidental byproducts of a lengthy process. And our morals or our sense of values have moved along like our ears or teeth. What about social pressure? We agree on what good is because we come together as human beings. Oh, are you justifying Nazi Germany? 6 million Jews, which we all disagree with. But if you want to hold on to the social pressure thesis, you have to say that 6 million Jews was okay at that time. This is why social pressure and evolution doesn't render objective morals, doesn't render morality objective. But the whole problem of evil argument assumes that evil and suffering are real and objective. But if they're real and objective, they necessitate God's existence in the first place. This is why I would argue in a very kind of rhetorical way that the problem of evil is a problem for the atheist because God is required as a basis for the question in the first place. Because you're saying evil and suffering are real, they're objective. Now you may say, well, I don't believe in objective morality. Well, then your argument becomes probabilistic, which means he probably doesn't exist, which therefore is not a very strong argument in the first place. Also, we need to understand there's an emotional argument to these things. Because look, according to the atheist, many babies in Iraq, in the Saddam Hussein regime, were put through mincemeat machines. That's what happened. What do? We just say there's no God, and that's it. and the baby was pointless. It's a very bleak, pessimistic, atheist view on life. What does the Muslim say? The Muslim says this: life's a test, there's wisdom we learn. Oh, and by the way, where did the baby go? Where does the babies go? Jannah, to paradise. It's more of an optimistic, empowering view on life, rather than pessimistic, look at all the evil in the world kind of view. So we have an emotional argument that really deals with these kind of concepts. Significantly, if anyone dies of cancer, stomach cancer, where do they go? They're a martyr, they're paradise. If you drown, the tsunami, just a few years ago, if you drown, where do you go according to the hadith literature, the prophetic traditions? Go to paradise. And it goes on and on and on. So we have these emotional arguments as well as the logical arguments that deal with this problem. So the problem of evil is actually a problem for the atheist, because the question itself necessitates the existence of God. Now, the first claim about the God of the gaps, I think that's very, very smart, very tricky. We can't explain something, so we shove God in there. Well, you need to be attentive to the argument. The argument was, let's start by questioning. And when we question, we go through an analysis. We look at the beginning of the universe. We understand about causality. We understand about conceptual analysis and thinking about the cause. Oh, our conclusions are then, there's a cause. And it has all these attributes. This is not God of the gaps. This is a process of thinking. It didn't start with a question that ended with God. It started with a question, went through a whole logical, rational process, then came to a conclusion. And this is quite the typical presumption of atheism. Atheism is true from the beginning. Therefore, theism or someone who believes in God is wrong. So the God of the gaps doesn't apply in this situation because it went through a logical, rational process. And you have to understand that the door swings both ways. If it's God for the gaps for us, then it's the atheism of the gaps for you, if you like, yeah? Then you talked about infinite. You say there's no infinite in the real world, or how can God be infinite? Well, listen to what I said. The infinity in the real world doesn't make sense. I agree that infinity in the mathematical realm of discourse, especially if you're a Platonist or whatever the case may be, does exist. Does make sense. So then we could just say, well, infinity in the metaphysical reality makes sense. And it's simple as that. My point was, infinity in the real world as we know it doesn't make sense, leads to paradoxes. I'm suspending my judgment on anything else. I actually said, well, it does exist, especially if you take the mathematical realm of discourse as another realm. So I think that deals with the issue as well. Also, with regards to the miracle, I think you have to understand that a miracle in this context is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of nature, which we exhaust the possibilities of nature. So what do? Stick to nature? That's a very huge assumption. You're assuming that the only way we can form conclusions is by the naturalistic methodology, touch and feel. But that's wrong, because the naturalistic methodology can't even prove mathematical truths. And finally, with regards to the subjective reality of the Quran, I have 1 minute. The subjective reality of the Quran, you have to understand something. If people disagree with it, it doesn't mean the argument is subjective all of a sudden. Okay? What my argument was that if the argument is true with the assumptions that I put into description, if it's true, then it renders it a miracle, because it's not based on subjective aesthetic criteria like Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare used nice eloquence, but he always used similar structure in the English language. For example, one of the structures were called the iambic pentameter. Christopher Marlowe used that. Many other English literatures used the same structure. I am saying the linguistic, literary form and structural features that are observable descope the Arabic language. It's not rhyme prose, it's not prose, it's not straightforward speech, it's none of the al-bihar, which in Arabic poetry are the 16 rhythmical patterns, the technical discussion, but it doesn't lie in any of these forms. It descopes the Arabic language. So it's not subjective from that perspective, it's objective because it has objective features that we can analyze. I hope that's been an interesting discussion. I think now's the time for us to have a positive conversation with the audience. So maybe we could elaborate some of the points that we made. I know it's a very short time. We should be here for 5 hours at least. But I'd like to thank everyone. Jazakallah.
Unfortunately, there's actually not going to be time for Q&A because we have another program immediately following this. and that program is the Islamization of weed. Yes, that's a question mark after the title, in case you didn't realize that part. So we'd like to thank both of our speakers for coming down. We'd like to thank all of our audience. We'd like everyone to stay, if you can stay for the second program. Hopefully it's been very enlightening to you. Hopefully, you see both religions, quote unquote, have a very similar mentality. As Dan pointed out himself, that he grew up in the Christian faith, yet he questioned himself and it led him to atheism. In Islam, we know as well, Hamza himself, he grew up in, what faith was it?
I was a humanist.
He was a humanist. He grew up in the humanist faith, which is closer to agnosticism or atheism, and he came into Islam. And you see that Islam itself actually teaches you to question, positively question, in order to find out the reality, to find out the truth about things. So, the Islamic Society thanks you for coming, Why Islam and One Legacy Radio, and since we do have home court advantage, you are in the masjid, and I am the imam of this masjid. I actually wrote an article as well called Why Does Allah Allow Bad Things to Happen? It's on our front page. I already uploaded it right now, coronamuslims.com. You can check out that article and I can give my 2 cents in there as well. We have some pamphlets here as well. You can grab them. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.